body, breath, and mind in perfect oneness. I send my heart along with the sound of the bell. May the hearers awaken from forgetfulness and transcend all anxiety and sorrow. Listen, listen, this wonderful sound brings us back to our true home. So welcome everyone. This is July 5th, 2017, and we're at the Mindfulness Community of Milwaukee Southgate Center, the home of the Stillwater Sangha. This is the third of our series of talks about mindfulness in the Thich Nhat Hahn tradition. And just a little bit of a review of where we came. The first week we talked about the three remarkable people, including the Buddha's journey. The Buddha, Thich Nhat Hahn, and you, as all being remarkable people that have traveled a path and will continue to do so. We also talked about the Buddha, and his first realizations was that there was a middle path, that there was a path between excessive deprivation and excessive infatuation, that there was something in the middle that he thought was the way to be. And he also talked about, and we talked about this last week a bit, was the concept of how we got into this situation, and expounded on the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, for a point of review, are there is suffering. The cause of suffering, which many people have, is a little bit different thing, but I like to think of as ignorance. Suffering can end, and what the path is for that. And as we all talked about a little last week as well, there is a particular trap that we all fall into. We all become all had this problem of defending ego and dealing with a life of fear and anxiety. Some of that being biologic, relating to our long human ancestry, and some of it just being the way that this particular society is. But we have that. And the truth of suffering says everybody does it. Everybody does it. It's not like you're immune to that. I mean, maybe there is somebody, I don't know. Maybe some particular fortunate soul never fell into the trap of suffering. And in saying that, we also say that suffering is our own fault. We did it. Without falling into this trap, we wouldn't suffer. But that being said, we all do it. It is this idea of discrimination. It's this idea of not being fully aware. It's the idea of sleepwalking through our lives instead of being fully in tune with them. And the other part of that last week was the good news, which we're going to talk about today, which is the idea that we don't need to suffer. We can make that choice, and that we all can make that choice. We do not need an outside savior. We do not need an outside organization or some sort of special blessing or transmission to be liberated. Everyone can do this because everyone is a Buddha. So there's one on your right, there's one on your left, and there's one sitting on your cushion. So this Buddhahood is just really wonderful. We can all have that particular demonstration. We can just really greet people. There's a wonderful little thing. We don't have a lot of kind of formal ceremony or anything, I suppose, in this tradition. But one thing you'll see us do a lot is the bow, right? And if you have this thing in your consciousness, then you can do this little gatha that Thich Nhat Hahn authored, which is a lotus to you, a Buddha to be. I sometimes do that, and actually instead of saying a lotus to you, a Buddha to be, I say a Buddha you are. A Buddha to be, at least I understand what he's saying. He's saying our manifestation of our Buddhahood still needs a little work, doesn't it? But I think the big thing about that is we don't really have to do anything special to be a Buddha. We already are. Isn't that interesting? And that we can just sort of learn how to manifest it. I thought I'd start before, well, I'll say this poem in just a moment. The idea is we need to be fully present. We need to be fully aware of what's going on in order to live a happy life. And or there's that little phrase that you see sometimes in like people who are doing raffles and lotteries where it says you must be present to win. Yeah, that's how it is. But the one poem that has really hit home for me with this is from Rumi, who of course is not in the Buddhist tradition but is in the contemplative tradition of his own. And it's called The Guest House. This being human is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture. Still, treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond. He is, of course, really talking about a lot of those things like a depression and a meanness, but he's also talking about things like joy as well. We meet everything fully. We meet everything with our whole being. This is how we gain wisdom. This is how we gain peace. And we don't do that very much all the time. At least that's not how we're trained. We're trained to forget. We're trained to put up walls. We're trained not to go into that sort of dark place necessarily. And we see dark places everywhere. Nevertheless, there is a lot of light going on as well. So there's a lot of different models for doing this. And I want to show the one that Thich Nhat Hahn has used very much. It's in a lot of his books, including probably the book that explains this the most is Understanding Our Mind, but there are other books that are having out that. And so I've estimated, I don't remember the exact number, but it's in the like low teens. I've been on retreat with Thich Nhat Hahn like 13, 14 times, something like that. And although sometimes he'll talk about the 5 skandhas, sometimes he'll talk about the paramitas or the Brahmaviharas or those kinds of things. And once he talked about neutrinos, which was really interesting. He always does this particular talk. He always does this as a great basis. So I know that it's very important to him. Jim, can you get this over? Okay. So, this is your consciousness. it's divided roughly into two parts. What is called mind and what is called store. Another wonderful way that Thich talks about this is your living room and this is your basement, and your basement's just all full of kind of dirt and stuff that you don't necessarily see. And all the things in your basement are out of your vision. They're not there. Your mind is what you are, and it's an area of awareness. You know, it's like what we're actually paying attention to at this particular moment. And of course, some of that is things that are sort of sensory things, such as sound, sight, certainly body sensations are very important. And some of them are just basically thoughts. But this is what's happening in our mind, and it's a constantly flowing thing as well. But in our basement, there are these things called seeds. A good gardener. Seeds. And the seeds are all those potential mental formations that you can manifest. So, for example, anger as a seed, or joy as a seed, fear, boredom, anything that you, almost all the things that you would have as you think of as emotions, certainly are seeds. Not only that though, but sometimes just even regular awarenesses are. So for example, volition is a seed, which is interesting, like what we do with our lives. And they often just sort of lie dormant there, and they sometimes will come springing up into our consciousness. We talk about a seed being watered, and it's in your consciousness. Actually, there's a really interesting book, one of Thach's old books called Touching Peace, where he talks about, of all things, a person having a storehouse of VCR, that's how old this book is, VCR tapes, who would run up the stairs and put it in your VCR and you'd have to watch it. Same sort of thing. So a seed is watered and then it stays there a while, sometimes a second or two, sometimes a month or two, and then returns back to the store consciousness. And these are always happening. Anger arises and falls. Fear arises and falls. Joy arises and falls. Compassion arises and falls. Everything arises and falls. And there are, depending on who you did this, in the traditional Abhidharma, there are 51 different types of seeds. Actually, Thich Nhat Hahn has added 13 more. So he had, I should find that refreshing. I find that refreshing that, he added 13 more seeds. It's like, whatever if you can't think of the Pope, for example, coming and say, I think I want 2 more new commandments. I'm just going to put them on there. So anyway, so there are lots of different types of things going on with that. And what happens with seeds is there's a natural tendency related to our biology. And again, last week when we talked about things from our hunter-gatherer days, we have seeds of anger and fear and suspicion because of what we did how we had to live as a hunter-gatherer, much less of a seed of curiosity, for example. And so we're often born with the anxiety and fear seeds being strong right from the beginning, but also things that have happened in our lives that have caused seeds of fear and anxiety, depression, dullness, whatever, to be watered as well. And so everybody has these 51 or 64 seeds. Everyone's got all of them. But they have varying degrees of how strong or how weak they are. And if a seed is very strong, it takes very little for something to bring it forth. So, for example, PTSD is a great example where people talk about that, where people, because their seeds of anger and fear have been watered so long and so consistently that it takes like just a tiny little drop of water, a little sprinkle, and the seed has manifested. Now, if you take somebody who's been practicing for a while or someone who hasn't had that, I imagine that the seed of anger in someone like the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hahn is relatively weak, but they still have them. They still have them, that kind of thing. So this is our lives, constant coming and going. We're a river of feelings. Seeds arise, seeds fall, seeds arise. And definitely if left to their own devices, then the seeds that are coming to the fore, however they come, become stronger. So if you do have a seed of anger and it keeps getting done one way or another, then the seed of anger gets more and more touchy, very strong. But it's also true for things like seeds of joy and seeds of compassion, seeds of mindfulness. All of these can be watered as well. Now, the seed of mindfulness is a very special type of seed. So, if you have a seed that is watered, let's say, they're divided often into wholesome and unwholesome, and sometimes indeterminate. For example, there's something like shame is a wholesome and guilt is an unwholesome, and don't ask me why that exactly is true. But the kinds of things that, instead of saying they're necessarily good or bad, but they're just things that happen. If you have a seed of anger, anger's the easiest for all of us to understand, isn't it? It just seems that everybody has the anger thing. We all know that one. And you catch it early, if particular. This is often difficult because anger is an extraordinarily urgent emotion, isn't it? It's one of the hot emotions. We say, oh, we're going to be mindful about our anger, but, it's like you're 30 seconds into your anger before you even realize, oh yeah, I should have been mindful. So that's a tricky one. But whenever you get to that point, if you can water the seed of mindfulness and embrace it, then when your anger is done, it returns back to the store consciousness, maybe 0.1% weaker, not much. But it continues to happen. So when we see anger, when we see fear, when we see all of those things coming, what we should try to do as much as we can is bring our mindfulness to bear so that we can make those seeds a little bit weaker. The interesting thing when we talk about a concept in medicine and physiology called homeostasis is when we bring our mind consciousness to bear on things that are joyful or good, they actually strengthen. In other words, your mind will want those things, and therefore they become a little bit more prominent, a little bit easier to bring up. So that's really most of the practice, is being aware of feelings. When we talk about the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the first one is body, which we'll get to in a minute, which I think is real important. And the second one is feelings. And that's interesting because we often think of that as actually being emotions, but in reality, it's whether we like or don't like something. They could call that one, if they wanted to, mindfulness of preference. It might be a little bit easier. And then the third one is the mindfulness of mind, what's going on with our mental formations. They all intertwine. The fourth one is mindfulness of objects of mind, which I'm not going to really bring in here right now. But what do I mean by bringing our mindfulness to bear? What do I mean by watering the seed of mindfulness? When anything arises, but particularly if it's a strong emotion, what we should do is pay as close attention to that as we can. I talked about this in the first week, where I said many people feel like they're being chased by a wild animal, or that there's a runaway truck after them. And I think someone asked me, I think it was you, Matt, asked, well, what does that look like to turn around and embrace the truck? But that's kind of how it is. We pay attention to our mind and our body, and we just pay attention. And everything softens, and everything becomes more manageable just by paying attention to our mind and our body, no matter what happens. There is a misstatement, so to speak, or a little bit of an inaccuracy in the word mindfulness itself. Most of the way that we talk about things has to do with, quite frankly, 19th century British anthropologists who found all this stuff and translated it into English. And now the English words that we use for these long-standing Sanskrit and Pali words. And the word that comes forth here is called smriti, which kind of does mean mindfulness. But the interesting part about that, it probably just means awareness as well. And I have a problem with the term mindfulness, even though we're the mindfulness community of Milwaukee and we practice mindfulness and we talk about it, and my goodness, it's a common thing that we talk about when we want to reference it. But it has this idea that we're between our two ears. There it is, mindfulness. I really think that the best way to look at this is bodyfulness at least as much, if not more. So most people, especially when they say, I don't think that I can handle what's going on there, all these thoughts that are flooding me when I'm angry or fearful or anxious, then just go into the body. Always go back to the body. Pay attention to the body. What's happening? Where do things feel queasy? Where do things feel good? What is just happening there? And with the greatest amount of attention, just allowing it to be. That's the real tricky part of this. So much of our lives is bent on fixing something or improving something with great striving and hard work, right? So you want to learn a foreign language. You want to know about, say, Europe because you're going on a trip. You want to play a musical instrument. For whatever it is, you strive, right? You have to do that. You have to do a certain amount of practice. You have to do a little bit of repetition. You have to kind of force your body to do things. You have to have an intention to actually add something on. The odd part about this practice, which tends to be a little bit difficult, I think, for Westerners, and I think it's really difficult if you're a Westerner and you are in an academic thinking field, is you just try to let it be and you don't try to figure it out. It just sounds like that just seems so strange. So you don't say things like, oh, I have a feeling of anger and my jaw is clenched. I'm going to try to unclench my jaw. You don't do that. You might find, as a matter of fact, you frequently find that by paying attention to the clenched jaw, it does go away or it does get less clenched. But you don't make that particular effort to do that. It's all observation. And the only volition here, the only part about that should be observation. Even the desire to make it change can be a problem. And that's really a difficult thing for people. It's like, well, what do you mean? The desire to, why am I doing this if I'm not trying to change things? All I can say is that you will definitely end up with a situation where the harder you strive for things, the more effort you put into it to grit your teeth and sort of, make it a real struggle to sit on the cushion, and you're gonna conquer this anger, you're gonna conquer this fear, you're gonna conquer this anxiety. Well, the more you have that attitude, the less successful you'll be. And the more that you just say, let's just be open. Whatever comes is what comes. Going back to the Rumi poem. It says, a joy, a depression, a meanness, some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all, even if they're a crowd of sorrows. I would say, especially if they're a crowd of sorrows. Especially if they're a crowd of sorrows. We bring them into our hearts, and we wish that we would be able to just sort of bring them to tea. There's a wonderful story about that in one of Thich Nhat Hanh's books, and I'm sure it's in many legendary little passages from other teachers in the Buddhist tradition about Zen and about Buddha and Mara getting together and having a cup of tea. Ananda, who is the Buddha's attendant, sees Mara coming up to the cave, and he wants to have an audience with the Buddha. And Ananda says, you can't come in. You can't come in. You're an enemy of the Buddha. You can't come in. And as he's very clever, the very clever thing he says is, Mara says is, did your master tell you he has enemies? He doesn't have enemies, And so they came in and they talked about their various kind of roles, and it's really quite a little pleasant exchange. And I would even go so far as to say, while you all, and I am without a doubt 100% certain of this, everybody, even people that you find who seem to be cruel and clueless, everybody has Buddha nature. They have basic goodness. But we also have Mara nature. We also have that tendency to be to protect the ego, to be selfish, to be even cruel. Those kinds of things are in us as well, and we need to always sort of be aware of that. So it's not just Buddha and Mara having a big, glorious battle on the night of their enlightenment. That's a wonderful story as well, or having it to tea. You have this kind of happening in you all the time. There's a wonderful little story. These things are so strange when they come up in the 20th and the 21st century, and they're on the web, so you're never sure if it really was that, but it's alleged to be an old Cherokee story about a grandfather giving a lesson to his grandson about the two wolves of the heart. And he could say that there are two wolves, the wolf of love and the wolf of hate. And they're constantly in him, and they're constantly at odds with each other, but they're very much part of him. And the grandson says to the grandfather, well, which wolf wins? And he says, the one I feed. And this is how we could look at that. We could almost call them the Buddha wolf and the Mara wolf as the same way. So also I have on your little sheet for tonight, and I hope you have this on the background there, nice little diagram that's similar to what this is, about the ways that we can water seeds. It's also really nice to have this because if you're going to hang out with Thich Nhat Hahn people, they're going to talk about watering seeds all the time. And if you don't know this thing, you don't know what the heck they're talking about. So the first way to do with watering seeds is to water your seed of mindfulness whenever anything comes up in your consciousness, especially the difficult things, but really anything. Paying attention to it as deeply as possible. I think if we were all Buddhas, we would be conscious of this 24/7, but we're not, and that's why we need to practice. But that's the first one, and probably the most important watering of the seed is to water the seed of mindfulness. I mean, one of the reasons we do all of this sitting on the cushions and walking meditation and talking about this is to strengthen that seed. That's really the common thing for a healthy life. So, a little sound of the bell. So that's an easy one, watering the seed of mindfulness so that mindfulness can be our ally as we deal with the unwholesome states of fear, anxiety, anger, depression, etc., etc. The second one is really also very important, which is to water wholesome seeds. It's really interesting. So, we always have this feeling about there's almost like a default setting in our brain going, things aren't really doing very well, are they? We're always checking on that sort of stuff. And if you look at this whole mind consciousness as a garden, the more wonderful plants there are, the more flowers there are, the more healthy flowers there are, the less chance there is for the weeds to grow. So we don't do that very much. We don't actually sit and water our wholesome seeds so much. We don't do things that are just for our own good and for our own pleasure. So, taking your cup of tea, and there's nothing else in the universe except for this cup of tea, and you drink. And you feel the warmth and the taste and the flavor. Those are watering those wholesome seeds. And watering, so eating meditation, walking meditation, sitting meditation, feeling the wonderful part of our breath. Any of those things can be ways to do this. Because it is a precious human birth, and there is more going on. When we often tend to neglect the things that, as we said in that poem in the first week, that are wrong. And Thich Nhat Hahn talked about publishing the good news. We only talk about things that are not wrong. There was a group of people who I saw on a video, must be 20 years ago now. It was a Catholic hospice group, and they were doing a lot of spiritual practice, but I'm sure that people were doing practices very much like this. And these were people in hospice. We all know, although we tend to want to forget, we all know we're going to die. But these people were going to die like Tuesday. I mean, they were like really close. And they would ask these people, very simple question, are you healthy? And they all answered yes. Yes, I'm healthy. I can pick up the phone and call my daughter. I can comb my hair. I can, see the sunshine coming in the windows. I can see the colors of the flowers. All of these things that we tend to let go by without a moment's notice. We don't stop. We don't only not stop and smell the roses, we don't stop and eat the peanut butter sandwich. Have you ever noticed that? Especially if you're a television watcher, you're watching television. But also people do this when they're reading books or newspapers or on the internet, right? You make yourself a sandwich, right? And you're like engrossed in what you're doing on the computer or the television, and then you look down and your plate's empty. And you say, what happened to my sandwich? Who took my sandwich? That we had all of this wonderful thing that we do. We all consume 2,000 or so calories a day at least. And it's all really wonderful. Why not take advantage of that? So we actually have to take some time, because we'll forget, to water our wholesome seeds, to water those seeds of enjoyment, to water the seeds of this life that are part of our birthright, just by being here, just by being on the planet. The third way to deal with watering seeds is to refrain from watering unwholesome seeds. So, although when unwholesome seeds do arise, we should bring our mindfulness. We can put ourselves in situations where our unwholesome seeds get watered. So, for example, I had a problem with this when I first took the 5 mindfulness trainings. I took the 5 mindfulness trainings back in 1995. And the 5th mindfulness training, which is about consumption, talked about refraining from all sorts of toxins, including toxic conversations. And I said, well, how can a conversation be toxic? Shouldn't you be able to meet it with mindfulness? But some conversations are toxic, aren't they? Some of them really will water our seeds of anger and fear. And my goodness, if there is, I think not a whole, but much of our political discourse nowadays is watering seeds of anger in people. That's how we kind of show that we have a staunch political cause, as we water the seeds of anger in the other side. And so we refrain from that. We refrain from putting ourselves in a situation. Anybody who's had a problem with an addiction knows that if you put yourself in the setting where the addiction occurred, you may have the greatest desire as an alcoholic not to drink, but if you go into bars, you're going to be watering that seed. And so we all know those sorts of things. So that's the third thing that we might do, is refrain, make a big effort not to water our wholesome seeds, even though we know that if the seed gets watered, we'll handle it better, and that as time goes on, we'll be able to have a weaker seed, a better seed mix, and a more beautiful garden. The fourth one, and this is one of my favorite things to do, is from time to time, when you're feeling perfectly calm, perfectly stable, invite mildly your seed of fear, or your seed of anger, or your seed of anxiety. When you're stable, just doing that. So, you're doing well, there's nothing really going on, but you know that tomorrow or later that day or this weekend, someone's going to water your seed of fear, or anger, or anxiety. And we all know also that one of the biggest problems here is that it is such a hot emotion all of these things. They're on us very quickly. That the earlier you get to it, the more workable it is, but we don't often get to it right away. So this is why we practice. There's a wonderful practice called Stepping into Fear that I have a CD on from Ron Siegel. It's really quite nice. So you're sitting on your cushion and you think of a moment. Just touch it lightly where it might be fearful. And as you notice the fear, how it is in your body, notice where you tighten up. Notice what thoughts come through your head. Notice whether your mouth is dry or your chest is tight or your stomach is doing flip-flops or whether your arms and legs seem very heavy or whether your arms and legs seem very energized. Just notice that so that when anger or fear comes into your life, you don't have to be overwhelmed by it. You can get to it earlier. You can work with it. And being able to do that is an extraordinarily important thing. So those are the 4 things. If you notice on your list, I have the 8 ways to water seeds, and I only gave you 4. You got to come back next week because we're going to talk about the other 4. We're going to talk about sort of collective consciousness. But once again, the most important thing is mindfulness, watering the seeds of mindfulness. Always being aware is a good cross-training for being aware. So it doesn't matter what you're aware of. Maybe you like music. If you're aware of music and you really pay attention to music, then that will help you take care of negative or unwholesome seeds. If you like beautiful art, or if you like to look in a beautiful sky or gardens, if you have those visual images, that awareness will help you be aware of what goes on. But also, of course, being aware of the body is so important because we tend to just forget about our body. So that's something you might want to have a little bit, even if you're not doing that. If you like your sounds and your sights and your tastes, I think it's still worthwhile to take some time to have some awareness of body. Awareness of body, and my goodness, I think that's really a lot of this culture anyway, is that we tend to not like our bodies. They're too big, they're too small, they're funny shaped, too much hair, not enough hair, whatever, and so therefore we tend to push them away. A wonderful story by James Joyce called An Unfortunate Case starts out with a guy by the name of Mr. Duffy. And the story says, Mr. Duffy lived a short distance from his body. And many of us kind of do that on a regular basis. So accepting it. Can we do this? Can we do this? Can we entertain all of the crowd of sorrows? Can we have the dark thought, the shame, the malice, and invite them in? The answer is absolutely. But one of the other things that our great teacher, Thich Nhat Hahn, says is we bring it in without making ourselves overwhelmed. You don't dive into the deep end of the pool. You avoid those situations if you can that are stressful, but but maybe see a little bit of a practice to go with that. It is really that simple. It's really, to me, it's just so surprising. We've got bookshelves full of books. We've got everything. We've got lectures about, we have millions of people making commentaries. And it's all just about paying attention. Who would have thought? Who would have thought it could be that easy? And sometimes it takes a while to trust that that's really the case. But try it out. See how it goes for you. See where the joy comes. The other part about that Thich Nhat Hahn would say is, if you have nothing else that's going on about it, it's just really nice to pay attention to things that are pleasant. It just makes them more pleasant. It's very, hedonistic, for want of a better word. We should all be hedonists. Or Thich Nhat Hahn says, if you're not finding joy in your mindfulness, you're probably not doing it right. So thank you all for your kind attention tonight. Do people have any questions about this or about the particular model or anything else about? Oh, the first way to water seeds. The first way to water seeds is to water the seed of mindfulness so that you are aware of what's going on in your life at all times. I mean, it's also, of course, very important to water the seed of mindfulness when you have those difficult, unwholesome things, but water your seed of mindfulness very frequently anyway. But certainly meet anything that enters into your consciousness as much as you can with mindfulness.
So I understand what you're saying about wholesome grab.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you can apply this to not like something like bipolar or something like serious.
Yeah.
Health.
Yeah. So, right. So the question is, people understand PTSD is a very good template for this. But what about things like bipolar disease or schizophrenia? Sometimes, yes. So there is a group of people who do a particular type of psychotherapy called dialectic behavioral therapy, DBT. And these people are real heroes of mine because they dive in everywhere. And although they're not successful with everybody who has bipolar disease or schizophrenia or borderline personality disorder, they're successful with some of them. And the reason that they're successful is people look at what's going on with that. For want of a better term, the personalization of what we do is really a problem for us. And so if you can look at, if you have say schizophrenia or bipolar disease, and you see these illusions as being very real and very much part of you, it's hard to get away from them. But if you just see them as something that happens to you, that's the thing about our thoughts. Our thoughts are very much things that we think are absolutely part of us. But in reality, thoughts just happen to us, like the light coming in or the sound of my voice. Thoughts are just things that happen to us, and we don't have to be kind of bullied and carried away with them. So yes, the mindfulness definitely can help with those conditions. Of course, definitely more of an uphill battle in those kinds of situations. But if there is some clarity and people wish to bring the mindfulness to even their very strong delusions, then they can. Actually, in a lot of ways, they're really lucky. Their delusions are so strong, they know they're delusions. So many of our little delusions, we don't know they're delusions because they seem perfectly reasonable to us. So, yes. Anything else?
So, how does this work? How does just simply being aware of what's going on, how does that mesh with like the Gatha and out, eat slow, calm, ease? That seems like you're trying to calm yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
Instead of just simply being aware. How do those two work together?
Yeah. So the question is, how does the idea of using a gatha or concentration, how does that really work in the idea of just letting be? I think when you start using gathas like calm, ease, and those sorts of things, I think that comes into the second category of watering a positive seed. So because we all have, no matter how unbelievably agitated we are, we have the seed of calmness in us. And so I think that's what that's kind of about. But if you're in a situation where you're really annoyed, I don't know that I would start doing the Thich Nhat Hahn gatha about, calm, ease. You're just going to be going, calm, ease. It's not going to seem right. So, yeah, that's how that all goes. There's basically kind of two ways about looking at meditation. One is the mindfulness, like whatever comes, comes, and we pay attention to it. But there is also concentration, and concentration has more volition to it. And I like to think of concentration as watering seeds. That's the best way I like to look at that is concentration is watering seeds. It's deciding. You're going to do a body scan, for example, or a meditation like that. You have to sit down and decide, I am going to put my consciousness in my knee or my back or my heart and those kinds of things. So that's watering the seed of awareness of your knee or your heart. So. Well, thank you all for your kind attention tonight. Next week we'll be talking about collective consciousness, and the title of that talk will be Happiness is Not an Individual Matter. One of my favorite quotes by Thich Nhat Hahn. Thank you all.